Navigating the world of fitness and physical enhancement can feel like a real maze, right? You're pushing hard in training, chasing those goals, and suddenly you start hearing whispers about substances promising faster results.
Yeah, stuff like MK-677 pops up, especially among younger people trying to maximize their training.
Exactly. And if you're someone who pauses, steps back, and thinks, hold on, I need to understand what this actually is and what it does before I even think about it, then you are absolutely on the right track.
Definitely. Making informed decisions about your health, I mean, especially when it comes to putting things in your body, it's just
Yeah, it
critical.
truly is. The online space is full of hype and personal stories, but when you're dealing with compounds that can really mess with your body, getting to the evidence is key.
It's essential for protecting your health long term. Yeah.
And that's our mission today. This deep dive is focused entirely on one specific compound, MK-677, also known as Ibutamoren. We've taken a deep look at a stack of sources, scientific papers, clinical trial data, expert analysis, trying to cut through the noise and figure out what the science really says.
Our goal is to give you a really thorough, evidence-based picture. We'll break down exactly what MK677 is scientifically, how it works in your body,
What effects have actually been seen in studies?
and most importantly, what the known and potential downsides are, the adverse health consequences. It's all about giving you the solid info you need to make a responsible choice, keeping your long-term health number one.
Okay, let's unpack this. Here's a roadmap for our journey through the source material. We'll start with the basic science. What MK677 is chemically, how it's classified, and, exactly how it interacts with your body.
How it actually does what it does.
Yeah. Then we'll clarify how it stacks up against other compounds you might hear about, like peptides, anabolic steroids, SARMs, and get into a really concerning aspect of how it's often used.
The stacking issue, yeah, that's important.
Definitely. We need to cover its legal and regulatory status too, which frankly raises some big red flags.
Absolutely.
After setting that foundation, we'll dive into the expected effects, the reasons people are drawn to it, and then crucially contrast those with a really comprehensive look at its documented and potential side effects. We got to focus on the serious risks there.
For sure.
We'll touch briefly on how it's typically taken and finally tackle that tricky question. Can you really mitigate the risks or avoid damage with something like this? Before wrapping up with our core conclusions.
Sounds like the essential route to understanding this compound. Let's get started.
All right, starting at the beginning. When we strip away all the online marketing hype, what is MK677 from a purely scientific perspective?
Okay, so at its core, it's a compound formerly known as ibutamoren. In research papers, you might see it pop up under developmental codes, like MK-0677.
And what kind of substance is it, chemically speaking?
Chemically, it falls into the category of growth hormone secretagogues, or GHS for short.
Secretagogue, so it causes secretion.
Exactly. Think of it as a substance that basically tells your body to release more growth hormone. More specifically, it's what we call a non-peptide agonist of the ghrelin receptor.
Ghrelin, isn't that often called the hunger hormone?
That's one of its key roles, yes. And agonist just means MK677 binds to the same receptor that your natural ghrelin would bind to.
Okay.
And it mimics ghrelin's actions at that specific receptor. So by activating the ghrelin receptor, it triggers your pituitary gland to release its own growth hormone.
Okay, so it's not like injecting growth hormone itself, it's pushing your body to make more.
Precisely. That's the secretagogue part. It stimulates secretion. And a really significant feature, something the sources really highlight, is that it's non-peptide and orally active.
Why is that distinction so important? Non-peptide, orally active.
Well, it's a critical difference. See, most peptides, because of their structure, they get broken down by your digestive system if you swallow them.
Ah, right. Like insulin needs to be injected.
Exactly. That's why peptide-based meds usually require injections. But MK677, it's designed chemically so that you can take it by mouth as a pill or powder mixed in liquid, and it still gets absorbed effectively into your system and works.
Ah, the convenience factor. So being easier to take makes it more accessible.
Totally. This oral activity significantly lowers the barrier to use. And honestly, it's a major reason why it's become so prevalent in, let's say, non-medical circles like bodybuilding.
Right.
Even though it's not actually an approved drug, it's just much simpler to swallow something than deal with needles.
Got it. Okay, so it mimics ghrelin, activates the ghrelin receptor, tells the pituitary gland release growth hormone. What happens after that GH gets released into the system?
So when the pituitary releases GH, that hormone travels through your bloodstream and signals other tissues, especially the liver, to produce another important factor called insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1.
Okay, IGF-1.
Yeah. So using MK-677 leads to elevated levels of both GH and IGF-1 circulating in your system.
And GH and IGF-1 are the big players in growth and repair, right?
Yeah.
Muscle building and all that.
Absolutely. They're pivotal hormones.
Yeah.
Super involved in muscle protein synthesis, regulating metabolism, helping with cellular repair, even supporting bone density.
Okay, so it's stimulating your body's natural GH production, not introducing synthetic GH from the outside. Does that make it inherently safer or maybe more natural, as some people might think?
See, this is a really, really important point that often gets misconstrued online. While yes, it stimulates your own production, the key insight for the sources is that MK-677 produces sustained elevated increases in the levels of both GH and IGF-1 in your bloodstream.
Sustained high levels, not just a quick pulse like the body normally does.
Exactly, and this is crucial. Whether your GH and IGF-1 are sky high because you injected them or because you took something that makes your body pump them out constantly, the physiological effects, and importantly, the potential adverse outcomes can be strikingly similar. Your body's natural, pulsed, tightly regulated system for releasing GH. It gets essentially overridden or significantly disrupted by this constant stimulation.
So it pushes your hormone levels way beyond their normal controlled range into unnatural territory.
Precisely. It results in what scientists sometimes call supraphysiological levels, levels above what's physiologically normal. And having these powerful hormones consistently high, day in, day out, can lead to risks that look a lot like the risks seen in conditions where people have chronic GH excess.
Okay.
Understanding this, that stimulating your own production doesn't automatically mean it's safer if it results in unnaturally high levels, is absolutely fundamental to understanding the potential dangers here.
That makes a lot of sense. The body's natural checks and balances are effectively being bypassed. Now, the fitness world, it's just full of different compounds, isn't it? How does MK-677 actually compare to substances people might be more familiar with, like, say, peptides or anabolic steroids or SARMs? It often seems to get lumped in with them.
It's a super confusing landscape out there, and yeah, they are frequently miscategorized or marketed together, but chemically, and in terms of how they actually work in the body, MK-677 really stands apart.
Okay, let's start with peptides. Since you mentioned MK-677 is non-peptide, how do they compare?
Right. So peptides, basically short chains of amino acids. Some peptides discussed for performance enhancement, like certain GH-releasing peptides, GHRPs, they actually share the same goal as MK-677 stimulating GH and IGF-1.
Okay, similar goal.
But the main practical difference, like we said, is delivery. Most of those peptides, they need to be injected because they get destroyed in your stomach. MK-677, being non-peptide, is orally active.
Gotcha. Similar aim, different way of getting it into the system. What about anabolic steroids? They feel completely different.
And they are fundamentally different. It's absolutely critical to understand this. MK-677 is not an anabolic steroid, full stop, even though it can have anabolic effects, meaning it helps build tissue like muscle.
How do steroids work then compared to MK-677?
Anabolic steroids work primarily by binding to androgen receptors in your muscles and bones. That's their main pathway for promoting growth and strength. They also have significant androgenic effects, the stuff linked to male characteristics, which can cause side effects like hair loss, acne, voice deepening, things like that.
And MK-677 doesn't touch those androgen receptors at all?
Nope. Its mechanism is entirely through the ghrelin receptor pathway we talked about, and consequently, the side effect profiles are very different. Steroids are notorious for potential liver toxicity, serious cardiovascular problems, and shutting down your body's natural testosterone production.
Okay, totally different mechanism, different risks compared to steroids. What about SARMs? Selective androgen receptor modulators. You hear MK-677 mentioned alongside SARMs all the time.
Yeah, and this is where things get particularly concerning. They're often mislabels or marketed together, even sold in the same bottle sometimes, but they are distinct, chemically and mechanistically.
So what are SARMs exactly?
SARMs were designed with the idea of selectively targeting androgen receptors, mainly in muscle and bone tissue. The goal was to get the anabolic muscle-building effects without as many of the unwanted androgenic side effects you get with traditional steroids, hence the selective part of the name.
Still working on the androgen receptor pathway, though, like steroids, just supposedly more targeted, unlike MK-677's ghrelin pathway.
Exactly right. Still fundamentally different from MK-677's mechanism. And it's crucial to know, despite that theoretical selectivity, SARMs themselves are illegal for human use. banned in sports, and carry their own serious safety concerns. We're talking increased risk of heart attack, stroke, and potentially life-threatening liver damage.
Wow, examples of SARMs people might have heard of.
Things like ostarine, which is also called MK-2866 confusingly, or RAD-140 LGD-4033. Those are some common names you might see.
Okay, so SARMs have their own serious risks. The fact that MK-677 and SARMs are often sold or used together, that's where this idea of dangerous synergy comes in.
Precisely. This is a significant risk that the source material really flags up. Think about it. MK-677 has its own documented risks, particularly potential cardiac issues and metabolic disruption. SARMs bring their own set of risks, like the severe liver damage and cardiovascular problems.
So you're layering risks on top of risks.
Exactly. When they are combined, which seems to be quite common because of how they're marketed in the bodybuilding or performance enhancement world, the potential for harm is significantly multiplied. You're creating this really complex physiological situation with overlapping, potentially additive, or even synergistic risks that could be much worse than using either substance on its own.
And the scary part is, you might not even know you're taking both.
That's a huge problem with the lack of regulation and transparent labeling in this illicit market. Products simply marketed as SARMs might secretly contain MK-677, or products sold as MK-677 might have SARMs mixed in, so users can be unknowingly exposed to multiple high-risk unapproved compounds.
And physiologically, combining MK-677's GHAGF1 boost with the androgenic effects of SARMs, that sounds like a recipe for unpredictable trouble.
That creates a much more complex and potentially hazardous internal environment, absolutely.
So just to quickly recap that comparison based on the source table, MK-677 is a GH secretagogue, non-peptide, oral, boosts GHAF1 via ghrelin receptor. Peptides are similar but usually injected. Anabolic steroids act on androgen receptors, steroidal structure, oral injectable, boost androgens systemically. SARMs also act on androgen receptors, non-steroidal, usually oral, aiming for selective androgenic activity.
That's a good summary. The table really drives home that MK-677 operates very differently from steroids and SARMs, even if the desired outcome, like muscle gain, might overlap.
And critically, in none of these, we've mentioned MK-677, peptides for performance, steroids, SARMs, none are approved by regulatory bodies like the FDA for performance enhancement, are they?
Crucially, no, not a single one. And they are all prohibited by organizations like the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, in tested sports.
Which leads us directly into the legal and regulatory status of MK-677 itself. You mentioned earlier it's an investigational new drug. What does that really mean in practical terms for legality and safety?
This is a critical piece of the puzzle, a major red flag. Ibutamoren, or MK-677, is formally classified as an investigational new drug, often shortened to IND.
Okay, IND status, what does that tell us?
It tells us that it is still under scientific investigation, it has not completed the rigorous review process, and it has not been approved by regulatory bodies like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, for marketing or sale for human consumption, for any purpose.
So it's basically an unapproved drug?
By definition, yes, it is an unapproved drug.
And it's illegal to put unapproved drugs in things sold as dietary supplements, right?
Absolutely illegal. The FDA has been very clear on this and has actively issued warning letters to companies caught illegally selling products containing MK-677, often disguised as supplements.
And it's not just an issue for the general public buying online, it's banned in professional arenas too.
Yes, definitely. It's widely prohibited in professional and amateur sports. It's explicitly listed on the WADA prohibited list, meaning athletes testing positive face serious sanctions. It's also included on the U.S. Department of Defense's list of prohibited ingredients for military personnel.
So using it could end your career if you're an athlete or in the military.
Absolutely. The consequences are severe.
And in some countries, the classification goes even further, really highlighting the perceived danger.
Right. The source material mentions that in certain places, like Australia, for example, possessing Ibutamoren without proper authority is illegal, and it's actually classified as a Schedule IV substance, essentially a prescription medicine, or even higher in some contexts, sometimes referred to alongside poisons, depending on the specific regulation.
Classifying it alongside poisons or requiring prescription really underscores the potential for serious harm. So what are the big implications of this unapproved and investigational status for someone out there considering using it?
The single most significant implication, really, is a fundamental lack of comprehensive safety and toxicity data, especially data on what happens with long-term use in humans. We just don't have it.
But despite that huge gap in knowledge.
Exactly. Despite this critical absence of safety validation, as the sources clearly point out, MK-677 is widely and aggressively marketed online, often with completely unsubstantiated claims like build muscle fast, anti-aging miracle, sometimes even calling it a fountain of youth.
That's a massive disconnect, isn't it? Substances not proven safe enough for a doctor to even prescribe are readily available online with these wild claims.
It is a huge disconnect. It highlights a significant regulatory challenge and honestly it leaves consumers incredibly vulnerable. You're essentially exposed to products with totally unknown long-term risks, often relying on marketing hype or anecdotes from strangers online rather than solid, robust scientific evidence. That poison or prescription-only classification in places like Australia really drives home how seriously some regulatory bodies view its potential danger.
Okay, so the big picture, legally and scientifically, has some serious warning signs flashing. But let's switch gears slightly. Let's talk about why people are interested in the first place. What are the expected effects? What are the purported benefits people hope to gain from using MK-677?
Now, the appeal really stems directly from its ability to stimulate growth hormone and IGF-1. Those are hormones strongly linked to the physical enhancement goals many people have.
Like muscle growth, changing body composition.
Yeah, that's probably the main one. Boosting GH and IGF-1 is central to the idea that MK-677 can help build muscle mass. Both hormones, as we said, are vital players in building muscle protein, helping cells repair, and influencing metabolism in a way that can favor lean tissue.
Okay, so that's the theory. Does the actual research show it increases muscle mass?
There is evidence from clinical studies showing it can impact body composition. Ibutamoren has been shown in some trials to increase lean body mass. Sometimes this happens without a corresponding increase in total fat mass, or that dangerous visceral fat around the organs.
Any specific examples?
Yeah, one study mentioned involved healthy older adults. Over 12 months, those taking MK-677 saw an average increase in fat-free mass, whereas the placebo group actually lost a bit. Another study showed it could help reverse diet-induced nitrogen wasting, basically, helping the body hold on to protein when calories are restricted, which is a key indicator of an anabolic or tissue-building effect.
Okay, so it can increase lean mass according to some studies. But here's the million-dollar question. Is that mass permanent, and does it actually make you functionally stronger, better performing?
This is where a crucial nuance comes in, highlighted in the sources. While you might indeed see an increase in muscle mass on the scale or in the mirror, these gains are generally not permanent. They tend to diminish if you stop taking the substance.
So it's temporary, dependent on continued use.
Seems that way. It suggests the benefit is contingent on continued exposure. And critically, this is really important. The sources emphasize that this increase in lean mass, this extra volume, does not consistently translate into improvements in functional strength or overall athletic performance.
So you might look bigger, but you aren't necessarily stronger or faster or able to lift more.
Exactly. The link between the mass gain and actual functional improvement isn't guaranteed or universally observed in the studies. That's a really important distinction for anyone whose goal is actual performance enhancement, not just appearance.
Definitely.
And furthermore, there are hints from animal studies suggesting the body might become less sensitive or desensitized to the GH-stimulating effect over time.
So might stop working as well.
Potentially. This implies the initial efficacy could diminish with prolonged use, which could then lead people to take higher dosages to chase that initial effect.
Which would obviously increase the risks.
Precisely. So, taken together, any muscle gains might be more of a temporary cosmetic effect rather than a sustainable enhancement of functional performance.
Okay, that's a key takeaway on muscle. What about bone mineral density? The sources seemed kind of contradictory on that point.
They absolutely do, and it is confusing. On one hand, some studies do suggest potential positive effects on bone. They've shown increases in bone mineral density, BMD markers, in some human studies, particularly in older adults or those with frailty. This hints it could be helpful in situations where bone health is already compromised, and we know IGF-1 itself plays a role in bone health.
Okay, so some potential positives there, maybe for specific groups. What's the contradictory part?
Well, other credible sources, including warnings cited in the material, explicitly state that MK-677 can negatively impact bone and bone mineral density, or potentially cause it to decrease.
How can it do both? increase it and decrease it.
It's puzzling. The source commentary tries to unpack this. The positive effects seen in studies often involved elderly individuals or those with low GH levels to begin with. So maybe it helps support or counteract bone loss in people whose bones are already compromised. Like one study showed it helped maintain bone formation when used alongside an osteoporosis drug.
So maybe it helps prevent loss rather than actively building new bone in healthy people.
That could be part of it. The warnings about a negative impact, on the other hand, might be general cautions based on unknown long-term effects, or maybe context-specific outcomes that we don't fully understand yet. For a healthy young person, say 18, with normally developing bones, the net effect might be negligible. And given the conflicting warnings and the huge question mark over long-term safety, any potential risks could easily outweigh some theoretical benefit.
So the takeaway for a healthy young person is, don't count on bone benefits, and be aware there are warnings about potential negative impacts. The picture is unclear at best.
Exactly. Too much uncertainty there.
What about sleep quality? That's something people often mention anecdotally.
Yep. That's an interesting observation reported in some studies. Research has shown MK-677 can actually alter sleep architecture. It's been reported to increase the duration of REM sleep and also deep slow-wave sleep in both younger and older subjects.
And good sleep is obviously crucial for recovery, cognitive function, everything.
It absolutely is. Improvements in sleep quality are definitely linked to enhanced cognitive function and overall tissue regeneration. This effect on sleep is likely a secondary consequence of the increased GH release, since GH is predominantly released in pulses during sleep.
But is it a reason to take the drug?
Well, that's the key question, isn't it? While better sleep sounds appealing, especially if you're an athlete training hard, is this potential benefit substantial enough to offset the documented and potential serious risks of using an unapproved substance? There's also a concern that feeling like you're sleeping better subjectively might actually mask more serious negative physiological changes happening under the surface. It's more of a potential side observation, not really a primary health benefit that mitigates the severe risks we need to talk about.
Makes sense. Okay, another effect I hear about constantly is increased appetite. The hunger effect.
Oh yeah, that's a very common report. And it makes perfect sense, right? It's a direct consequence of MK-677 mimicking ghrelin, and ghrelin is famously linked to stimulating hunger and regulating energy balance.
So for someone trying to bulk up, gain weight, consume a lot of calories, that might actually seem like a good thing.
It can definitely be perceived that way. If you struggle with appetite but need to eat a large caloric surplus to gain muscle, making you feel hungrier might make that easier. But it's a classic double-edged sword. If you're not really disciplined with your food choices, or if your goal is actually to stay lean or cut fat, that increased hunger can easily lead to unwanted weight gain, specifically fat mass, which would be counterproductive.
Right.
And some users also report that this intense hunger effect might actually subside after a few months of use anyway. So it just highlights how even the perceived positive effects can be temporary and have unintended consequences depending on your goals and discipline.
Any other potential benefits mentioned in the sources, even if they're less established or more speculative?
The sources briefly mention other areas sometimes discussed in research or anecdotally. Things like potentially enhanced recovery from workouts or injuries, maybe some positive effects on ligaments and tendons, and the occasional mention in relation to anti-aging effects or improving cognitive function.
But these are pretty much just ideas being explored.
Exactly. It's crucial to stress these are largely investigational areas. They are not FDA-approved uses, and the evidence supporting them for healthy individuals using MK-677 is generally weak or non-existent outside of specific research contexts.
Okay, so summing up the benefits, potential for temporary lean mass gain, not necessarily strength, maybe some sleep changes, increased appetite, which can be good or bad, and very unclear effects on bone in healthy people. Lots of question marks there.
Definitely more question marks and caveats than solid, proven benefits for a healthy person seeking performance enhancement.
All right, now for the part that really demands our full attention. The comprehensive review of established and potential side effects. What are the downsides, the risks we absolutely need to be aware of?
This is, without doubt, the most critical section for anyone considering this substance. The risks outlined in the sources are significant and require very careful, serious consideration.
Okay, let's start with the more commonly reported side effects, the ones people often experience.
Right. So commonly reported things include that increased appetite we just talked about. Also, swelling or fluid retention edema is quite common, often noticeable as puffiness in the hands, feet, or lower legs.
Like feeling bloated or watery?
Exactly. Some users also report experiencing anxiety or feelings of numbness or tingling, sometimes described as pins and needles. Muscle pain and joint pain, what doctors call arthralgias, are also frequently mentioned. Feelings of lethargy or fatigue, just feeling wiped out, can occur too. And some people experience gastrointestinal issues like diarrhea or nausea.
Carpal tunnel syndrome is on that list in the source, too. How does that happen?
Yeah, carpal tunnel syndrome has been reported. It's likely linked directly to that fluid retention. The extra fluid can increase pressure within the carpal tunnel in your wrist, compressing the median nerve and causing those characteristic symptoms of pain, numbness, and tingling in the hand. Headaches and tinnitus, that annoying ringing in the ears, have also been noted as potential side effects.
Okay, so those are the common, maybe more manageable ones, though still unpleasant. What about the more systemic impacts on metabolism or hormones more broadly?
This is where we get into some really serious concerns highlighted consistently across the sources. MK-677 appears to have a quite notable and negative impact on your metabolism, specifically how your body handles glucose and insulin.
How so?
It's consistently reported in studies to cause increases in fasting blood glucose levels, so higher blood sugar when you haven't eaten. And alongside that, a reduction in insulin sensitivity, meaning your body cells don't respond as well to insulin, the hormone that's supposed to help them take up glucose from the blood.
Higher blood sugar and your body becoming less responsive to insulin. That sounds worryingly like it's pushing you towards diabetes, doesn't it?
It is extremely concerning, yes. This combination can significantly heighten your risk of hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, and lead to higher levels of something called glycated hemoglobin, or HbA1c. HbA1c is a marker doctors use to see your average blood sugar control over the past few months. Multiple studies have specifically noted this impairment of glucose homeostasis.
And the source material used strong language there.
It did. It described this consistent pattern as having a potential diabetes-like impact, which really paints a clear picture of significant metabolic disruption.
What are the potential long-term implications of messing with your insulin sensitivity and blood sugar like that, especially for someone young, say 18?
Well, while short-term increases might seem like something you could manage or ignore, prolonged exposure, especially for a young person whose endocrine system is still developing and maturing, could potentially accelerate the onset of full-blown insulin resistance. Or even worse, push them toward developing type 2 diabetes much earlier in life than they otherwise might have.
Why is it so vulnerable?
The vulnerability exists because sustained high levels of growth hormone and IGF-1, which is exactly what MK-677 causes, inherently tend to induce insulin resistance. It's a known physiological effect of having too much GH-IGF-1 around. So for an 18-year-old, inducing this kind of metabolic state could potentially carry severe, lasting health consequences down the road. We're talking about an increased predisposition later in life to cardiovascular disease, kidney damage, nerve damage, all the nasty complications associated with diabetes and insulin resistance.
And can you just take a pill to fix insulin resistance if this happens?
That's another critical point mentioned. Currently, there are no specific medications that directly treat the underlying state of insulin resistance itself. The treatments we have, like metformin or statins, focus on managing the downstream consequences once conditions like diabetes or high cholesterol are actually diagnosed. They're treatments for established medical conditions, not preventive measures you can take while using MK-677 to stop the metabolic damage from happening.
Wow. Okay, so major metabolic red flags. What about cortisol levels? Did these sources clarify the effect there? Is that another hormonal concern?
The data on cortisol seems a bit less consistent based on the review. Some sources suggested MK-677 might raise cortisol levels. However, others reported studies showing only transient, temporary increases or even no significant difference compared to placebo, especially in shorter-term studies. So the impact on cortisol seems less clear-cut and maybe less consistently problematic than the significant effects on glucose and insulin metabolism. It's been raised as a possibility, but perhaps not as established a risk.
Okay, metabolic disruption is a major, well-supported concern. Let's move to cardiovascular risks. You mentioned potential heart issues earlier.
Yes, and this is arguably the most serious and alarming risk documented in the source material regarding MK-677. The FDA itself, the U.S. regulatory body, has issued explicit warnings about this. They've stated that Ibutamoren, quote, poses significant safety risks due to the potential for congestive heart failure in certain patients.
Potential for congestive heart failure. That is incredibly serious. Is that just a theoretical possibility, or is there concrete evidence behind that warning?
It is absolutely not merely theoretical. This major concern is based on actual evidence. The sources confirmed that at least one clinical trial investigating ibutamoren in elderly patients with hip fractures was terminated, prematurely stopped early, specifically because of documented safety concerns that the substance might be increasing the rate of congestive heart failure among the participants.
Wow. Terminating a clinical trial early for safety reasons?
Yeah.
That's a really strong signal, isn't it? That only happens when a clear, unacceptable safety issue emerges during the study.
Absolutely. A trial termination due to safety concerns is a critical indicator of a severe documented risk. It means a direct and concrete danger became apparent to the researchers and regulators overseeing the trial. The FDA's explicit warning about congestive heart failure directly reflects that serious finding. The Australian classification we mentioned also highlight potential adverse cardiovascular effects as a reason for concern.
So what does this mean for, say, our hypothetical 18-year-old considering this for muscle gain?
It means introducing a substance with this documented risk of potentially inducing congestive heart failure is profoundly dangerous and, frankly, irresponsible. Heart failure isn't a minor side effect. It's a life-altering, often progressive, and potentially fatal condition where the heart can't pump blood effectively. This single risk, the potential for catastrophic heart damage, dramatically outweighs any perceived, likely, temporary muscle-building benefits. It's a risk that just cannot be ignored.
That is a very, very strong warning, one that really demands attention. Okay, going back briefly to bone health, the side effects section in the sources mentioned again, reinforcing that conflicting picture.
Yes, just circling back to really emphasize that contradictory data point. While, again, some studies in specific, often compromised populations, suggested potential increases in bone markers, other credible sources explicitly warn that MK-677 can negatively impact bone and bone mineral density. This inconsistency itself is a major warning sign. It highlights the need for extreme caution and confirms there isn't a clear universally beneficial effect on bones, especially in healthy young individuals, while potential risks are definitely present and poorly understood.
Right. So another area of uncertainty and potential risk, what about liver and kidney health? We often hear about those organs being stressed by other types of performance-enhancing drugs.
That's a good question. Direct liver damage caused by MK-677 when used alone isn't as prominently listed in the source material as a primary standalone side effect compared to, say, anabolic steroids.
Oh.
However, and this is a huge however, a critical warning emerges when you consider how MK-677 is commonly used in the real world, co-administered or stacked with other substances, particularly SARMs.
Ah, back to the stacking issue.
Exactly. The source of material is explicit here. It states that when combined with SARMs, MK-677 could negatively impact serum lipids, liver enzymes, testosterone levels, or worse. And it goes on to add that SARMs on their own are known to be associated with serious safety concerns, including life-threatening reactions such as liver damage.
So the risk isn't necessarily just from MK-677 itself in isolation, but significantly magnified by how people often actually use it.
Precisely. While MK-677 might have a lower direct liver toxicity profile on its own compared to some other compounds, though long-term effects are unknown, the frequent practice of combining it with SARMs dramatically escalates the risk of severe liver injury. There are published case reports documenting instances where SARMs, like a RAD140, have caused severe cholestatic liver injury, a condition where bile flow from the liver is blocked, which can potentially progress rapidly to acute liver failure requiring an emergency liver transplant.
That's terrifying.
It is. So when you combine MK-677 with its own metabolic and cardiac risks, and SARMs with their known liver and cardiovascular risks, you're creating multiplicative, poorly characterized risks, particularly for your liver, a vital organ, with only limited capacity to regenerate after severe damage. And because MK-677 is an unapproved drug, the full extent of its potential side effects on other organs like the kidneys also remains largely unknown simply because it hasn't been adequately studied in humans long term.
This all seems to lead inevitably to perhaps the most critical point of all, the long-term safety profile and the vast, gaping unknowns surrounding MK-677.
This is arguably the single most alarming aspect highlighted repeatedly throughout the source material. There is a pervasive, frankly, shocking lack of established long-term toxicity data for MK-677 in humans. Multiple sources state this explicitly, unequivocally. Long-term safety is not established. And another quote, "There is no toxicity data, and the extent of potential side effects, particularly long-term ones, remain unknown."
That's not just a minor detail, is it? That's a fundamental lack of the most important information you'd want.
It is a fundamental gaping hole in our scientific understanding, and it has profound implications for anyone considering using this substance. For an 18-year-old, someone whose body is still maturing and who anticipates hopefully many decades of life ahead, introducing a substance with completely unquantified long-term effects is essentially a gamble. A gamble with potentially irreversible consequences that you simply cannot foresee or predict.
And animal studies hinted that any benefits might fade anyway.
Yeah, there were indications from animal models that prolonged administration didn't necessarily promote ongoing growth, and the initial GH response might even be abolished over time, possibly due to the body adapting and increasing inhibitory signals. This raises the concern that users might not only face unknown long-term risks, but might also find the perceived benefits diminishing, potentially leading them to increase the dose.
Further increasing their exposure to those unknown risks.
Exactly.
You had seen earlier that the side effects profile is expected to be similar to conditions of chronic GH elevation. What are the typical long-term risks associated with that, with having too much growth hormone for too long?
Well, the classic medical condition of uncontrolled chronic GH excess in adults is called acromegaly. It's usually caused by a pituitary tumor. And over time, acromegaly leads to a whole range of severe, often irreversible complications. We're talking about things like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, various forms of heart disease, including enlarged heart, sleep apnea, debilitating arthritis, carpal tunnel syndrome, and potentially even an increased risk of developing certain types of cancer, like colorectal cancer.
And because MK-677 causes sustained elevation of GH and IGF-1, even if it doesn't cause full-blown acromegaly from a tumor, the physiological risks start to overlap significantly.
That's the logical connection, yes. While it's not definitively proven that recreational MK-677 use causes the full syndrome of acromegaly, the fact that it induces a state of sustained elevation of GH and IGF-1 means the physiological state you're creating in your body carries risks that align closely with those seen in conditions of chronic GH elevation. You're essentially mimicking some aspects of that disease state.
So the unknown unknowns, the things we don't know about the long-term effects, are really the biggest concern here.
They absolutely are. The absence of comprehensive long-term human data means the risks are not just present and serious based on what we do know, like the heart failure signal. They're also fundamentally unquantifiable in their full scope. This inherent uncertainty makes the decision to use MK-677 exceptionally high risk because the full extent of potential harm, especially harm that might only manifest years or decades down the line, simply cannot be predicted or prevented.
And this ties back to what you said earlier.
Yes, as the source material makes starkly clear, the very concept of using MK-677 and somehow achieving no damage is fundamentally incompatible with our current scientific understanding of its known risks and, crucially, its unapproved status and the vast unknowns surrounding its long-term safety.
That's a powerful and deeply concerning conclusion. Looking at the summary table of side effects mentioned in the source, it really drives home the sheer breadth of the potential issues, doesn't it?
It really does. The sources basically categorize them. You've got the common ones we discussed, the fluid retention, joint pain, increased appetite, anxiety, lethargy. Then the significant metabolic impacts, the increased blood sugar, the reduced insulin sensitivity pushing towards a diabetes-like state. Then the major cardiovascular concern, the potential for congestive heart failure, serious enough to halt a clinical trial. And then this bucket of other serious potential issues, including the negative question marks around bone density, the high risk of severe liver damage, especially when stacked with SARMs, other potential hormonal disruptions beyond just GH-IGF-1, and that theoretical link to increased cancer risk down the line based on the known effects of chronic GH excess.
Seeing all those laid out together, from the everyday discomforts to the potentially life-threatening cardiovascular risk and the huge black box of unknown long-term effects, it's incredibly sobering. Okay, let's briefly touch on the practical side. How is it typically administered? You emphasized it's oral.
Yes, that's really its defining characteristic from a practical standpoint, as mentioned in the sources. It is orally active. That means it's effectively absorbed and utilized by the body when taken by mouth, typically sold as a powder to be mixed, or in capsules, tablets, or premixed liquids.
And that's a big difference from other things.
It's a huge practical advantage over many other GH-related therapies or peptides that necessitate injections because they'd be destroyed by digestion. MK-677's chemical structure allows it to bypass that breakdown in the gut.
And it's described as being pretty effective when taken orally, bioavailable and potent.
Yes, the sources describe it as orally bioavailable, meaning a good portion of it gets into your system. And it has been clearly shown to produce those sustained increases in GH and IGF-1 levels we talked about. Studies have documented significant increases in IGF-1 levels in humans, sometimes remaining elevated for up to 24 hours after just a single oral dose.
Yeah.
And it can significantly boost GH secretion as well.
What kind of dosages are typically seen in the research studies?
In the research settings, the dosages used have typically ranged somewhere between 10 milligrams and 50 milligrams per day. A dose of 25 milligrams per day seems to have been quite common in many of the clinical trials cited.
And even though its half-life might be shorter, the effect lasts longer.
Right. The reported half-life, how long it takes for half the drug to be cleared from the blood, might be around 4 to 6 hours based on some animal data. But the physiological effect, particularly the sustained elevation of IGF-1 levels in humans for 24 hours, clearly indicates a much more prolonged biological action.
So it's easy to take, it works when swallowed, and its effects last a good while physiologically. This convenience factor seems like it must contribute significantly to its unsupervised use outside of medical settings.
It absolutely does. The high oral bioavailability combined with the prolonged physiological effects makes it exceptionally convenient for self-administration. It's easy to see why it's attractive. But this ease of use, coupled with its ready availability online through often unregulated vendors, unfortunately leads many people to use it entirely without appropriate medical guidance or supervision.
And they're trying to figure out dosages based on,
Well,
online forums?
often, yes. People might be chasing the optimal dosage or the most potent effects based on anecdotal reports or bodybuilding forum discussions, rather than relying on dosages tested in controlled research settings, which, remember, still uncovered serious risks like heart failure. And that focus on potency needs to be constantly viewed through the lens of risk.
Plus that desensitization issue you mentioned.
Exactly. The animal data suggesting desensitization over time implies that even those initial potent effects might not be sustained, which could, perversely, encourage users to escalate their dose, trying to recapture that initial feeling, thereby increasing their exposure to potential harm, both known and unknown. The sheer convenience can create a false sense of safety or simplicity.
So the bottom line is there's no known optimal way to use it safely.
The truth is, based on the sources, there's simply no established optimal method for safe and effective dosing of MK-677 in humans without risking significant adverse health consequences, because the necessary long-term human safety data to establish such a protocol simply does not exist.
Which brings us crashing right into that fundamental critical question. Can you truly mitigate the risk? Can you somehow avoid damage when using a substance like this? People want to know what they can take with it or how to cycle it to be safe.
It's a very natural and understandable question. Everyone wants the potential benefits without the downsides, right? The desire to achieve physical enhancement while avoiding negative consequences is human nature. But we absolutely have to confront the reality of the risks involved with MK-677 and the severe limitations, maybe even impossibility, of truly mitigating those risks based on the available scientific evidence.
So that aspiration people might have for using it with no damage, you're saying that's just unrealistic here.
Fundamentally unrealistic, yes. The desire to use something like this and experience no damage, often coupled with the hope of doing so without needing medical oversight or dealing with regulations, is understandable, but it is simply not aligned with the reality of what MK-677 is, an unapproved investigational substance with documented serious health risks.
Can you remind us why that unapproved status is key here?
Because it means its full safety profile has not been established. There are no comprehensive long-term human studies defining all the potential harms. And yet we do know it carries documented serious risks, like that potential for congestive heart failure, like the significant metabolic disruptions leading towards diabetes. The sources explicitly state, again and again, long-term safety is not established. That means the full extent of potential harm remains unknown and therefore unquantifiable.
So when people ask about mitigation strategies or how to avoid damage, it reveals they might be underestimating the unknown aspects. They think the risks are all mapped out and manageable.
Exactly. It often reveals a common misperception that the risks associated with MK-677 are fully known and can therefore be completely controlled or eliminated with the right protocol. But because it's an investigational new drug, its complete safety profile is unknown. The risks we do know about are severe, and the long-term effects are simply not established. This puts any individual using it squarely in the realm of unknown unknowns, where the potential for unforeseen or irreversible damage is a constant lurking threat.
And strategies for managing side effects of diagnosed GH excess aren't applicable here.
Right. While doctors have strategies for managing the known side effects of diagnosed medical conditions involving growth hormone excess, like acromegaly, those are complex medical interventions for established diseases. They are not prophylactic measures designed for or appropriate for someone recreationally using an unapproved substance to induce similar hormonal changes.
So any attempt at mitigation with MK-677 is inherently limited at best. It cannot guarantee safety.
Severely limited, yes.
Yeah.
It absolutely cannot guarantee safety. The risk isn't just about trying to manage the side effects we already know about, which is hard enough without medical supervision. It's about the profound possibility of unforeseen or irreversible damage cropping up years later, damage that hasn't even been identified yet, because the necessary long-term human data simply doesn't exist. That core concept of achieving no damage while using MK-677 is, based on everything we've reviewed, fundamentally incompatible with the current scientific understanding and its regulatory status.
Okay. But let's play devil's advocate. If someone, despite hearing all these profound risks and warnings, was still determined to use MK-677, are there any strategies they might hypothetically employ to try and manage the known side effects? Understanding these are just general health measures, not specific cures or guarantees.
Okay, but with that massive caveat firmly in place that these strategies absolutely do not eliminate the fundamental risks associated with using an unapproved substance with unknown long-term effects, we can talk about general health measures. These are presented purely as strategies that might help manage some of the known potential side effects if someone chose to ignore clear advice and proceed anyway.
Like for the insulin sensitivity and blood glucose issues.
Right. For those issues which manifest as increased fasting glucose and decreased insulin sensitivity, the general strategies would be derived from standard recommendations for managing insulin resistance in the broader population. This means lifestyle modifications, focusing on a nutritious diet rich in whole foods, reducing processed carbohydrates and unhealthy fats, increasing lean protein and vegetables. Regular, moderate-intensity physical activity is also key, as it helps muscles utilize glucose and improves insulin sensitivity. Managing excess body weight is also important.
But again, no magic pill to counteract MK-677's effect directly.
Correct. As the source points out very clearly, there are no specific medications designed to treat the insulin resistance induced by something like MK-677 itself. Medications like metformin are prescribed by doctors only for diagnosed conditions like diabetes or prediabetes. They are treatments for established medical problems, not preventative measures you can pop alongside MK-677 to negate its metabolic effects.
Okay, what about the water retention, the edema, any hacks for that mentioned?
Well, for water retention, which is a common side effect, some anecdotal advice you might see online mentions cycling, the use of MK-677 taking periods off, supposedly to minimize tolerance or maintain effectiveness. However, the sources we reviewed don't explicitly confirm this actually helps with edema specifically. And they note that water retention from peptides, for instance, can often be temporary anyway, as the body adjusts over the initial weeks.
And does cycling eliminate the other risks?
There is absolutely no robust scientific evidence to suggest that this cycling strategy, often promoted in illicit use circles, eliminates the fundamental risks or prevents potential long-term damage. In fact, given the animal data on desensitization potentially leading to dose escalation, it's hard to see how intermittent use would guarantee safety. It remains an unproven practice based on anecdote, not science.
So if someone were going down this risky path, general health monitoring seems like it would be absolutely crucial.
Absolutely paramount. Non-negotiable, really, though still insufficient. Regularly tracking key health markers would be essential to try and identify adverse effects as early as possible in the hope of potentially preventing catastrophic long-term complications.
What kind of monitoring are we talking about?
We're talking about consistent blood tests, checking things like fasting glucose and HbA1c to monitor metabolic effects, liver enzyme tests to watch for liver strain, especially if combined with other substances, lipid profiles to check cholesterol, and probably a comprehensive hormonal panel including IGF-1 and GH levels to see just how much the substance is impacting the endocrine system. And given the documented cardiovascular concerns, regular cardiovascular assessments like blood pressure checks and maybe even EKGs or echocardiograms under medical guidance, which again is unlikely outside a trial, would seem vital.
You also referenced earlier the actual medical treatments for uncontrolled GH excess conditions like acromegaly, not as suggestions for users, obviously, but to illustrate the seriousness of messing with the system.
Yes, exactly. Presenting those treatments serves to highlight the sheer complexity and invasiveness of the interventions required when the body's natural growth hormone regulation system is fundamentally disrupted, leading to a diagnosed medical condition. These aren't casual treatments.
What do they involve?
They involve things like neurosurgery to remove pituitary tumors, causing the excess GH, powerful medications like somatostatin analogs, octreotide, lanreotide, or GH receptor antagonists, pegvisomant, designed to block GH production or action. Sometimes dopamine agonists or even radiation therapy are used. These are major medical interventions requiring significant specialist oversight, and they carry their own substantial set of potential side effects and risks.
So putting it all together, is it fair to say there are essentially no specific validated medical protocols for managing MK-677 side effects precisely because it's an unapproved drug?
That is a key, unavoidable conclusion from the source commentary. While general health advice like eating well and exercising is always good for supporting overall metabolic well-being, there are no specific medical protocols designed or proven to manage the unique side effect profile of MK-677. Because it's an unapproved drug, it hasn't been studied in that way. The established treatments for GH excess are strictly for severe, clinically diagnosed medical conditions, not for managing self-induced hormonal imbalances from recreational off-label use.
What does that mean practically if someone using it runs into serious trouble?
It means if serious side effects do occur, the individual is essentially operating in largely uncharted medical territory. They might require emergency care, but the doctors treating them may have no clear guidelines or established protocols for how to specifically manage complications arising from MK-677 use. And as we've established, common practices like cycling, borrowed from illicit drug use culture, have zero scientific evidence confirming they eliminate risk or prevent long-term damage.
So the message is clear. Individuals absolutely cannot rely on these supposed mitigation strategies to ensure their safety when using MK-677.
Correct. The source material is unequivocal on this. Attempting to self-manage the potentially serious side effects of an unapproved investigational drug is profoundly dangerous and could very well lead to irreversible health consequences. The single most effective mitigation strategy for the risks associated with MK-677 is simply avoiding the substance entirely.
And getting legitimate professional medical supervision isn't really an option here, is it? Since it's unapproved outside of research trials.
Down the way you typically seek medical care for a health issue or get a prescription monitored. The sources explicitly state that because MK-677 is an investigational drug, it should only be taken under the supervision of healthcare professionals in the context of a clinical trial. This just underscores the inherent danger and fundamental inappropriateness of self-administration by the general public.
So the inherent risks of using unapproved substances like this really boil down to the fact that the full extent of long-term safety is completely unknown, and therefore the risks cannot be fully managed or prevented no matter what you try.
Precisely. Any mitigation efforts are inherently and severely limited when the long-term safety profile and the full range of potential toxicities are simply not known. That absence of comprehensive data means, as the source reiterates, the full extent of its potential side effects, particularly long-term ones, remain unknown. This fundamental lack of knowledge means any use of MK-677 inevitably carries unquantifiable risks that simply cannot be fully managed, mitigated, or prevented.
Wow. This deep dive has painted a very clear and, frankly, quite concerning picture based on all the source material we've covered. Let's try to summarize the absolute key takeaways for everyone listening.
Okay, let's distill it down. Here are the core points. MK-677, also called Ibutamoren, is an orally active compound classified as a growth hormone secretagogue. It works by mimicking the hormone ghrelin, which then stimulates your body to produce and release more of its own growth hormone, GH, and subsequently IGF-1.
And the potential upsides.
This can lead to potential short-term increases in lean muscle mass. It might influence sleep patterns, possibly improving aspects like REM and deep sleep. And it could potentially offer some bone density support, but primarily this has been suggested in specific populations who already have compromised bone health, not necessarily healthy young individuals. There's also the common effect of increased appetite.
But the caveats on those benefits are huge.
Absolutely huge. It's crucial to remember. Any muscle gains observed tend to be temporary and often don't translate to improved functional strength or performance. The benefits might also diminish over time due to potential desensitization. The sleep effects are secondary. The appetite effect can be counterproductive. And the bone effects in healthy people are uncertain at best, with warnings of negative impacts.
Okay, now the risks, the major ones.
Yes, the significant health risks are a major focus and the most critical takeaway. There is a notable potential for congestive heart failure, a risk serious enough that it caused a clinical trial to be stopped early. There are consistent adverse metabolic effects, increased fasting blood glucose, reduced insulin sensitivity, creating a real risk of pushing someone towards a pre-diabetic or diabetic state.
And the common side effects and stacking risks.
Common side effects include fluid retention, edema, joint and muscle pain, anxiety, and lethargy. And critically, when MK-677 is commonly combined or stacked with SARMs, there appears to be a significantly elevated risk of severe, potentially life-threatening liver injury.
And overarching all of this is the biggest unknown of all.
Exactly. The single most alarming aspect highlighted throughout the sources is the critical, pervasive lack of established long-term safety data in humans. Because MK-677 is an investigational new drug, not approved for widespread human use, the full spectrum and severity of its long-term effects, particularly on a healthy young individual over years or decades, are completely unknown and simply cannot be quantified. This inherent uncertainty means the potential for irreversible harm cannot be reliably predicted or prevented.
And let's not forget, it's prohibited in sports and even classified alongside poisons or as prescription only in some places.
Correct. Important context.
So given absolutely everything we've discussed, pulling all this information from the sources together, what is the overall conclusion? What's the bottom line regarding the use of MK-677, especially for someone young and healthy, maybe that 18-year-old we mentioned?
The conclusion drawn from the comprehensive source material is unambiguous and strongly cautionary. Given the inherent, documented, and also unquantifiable risks, including that terrifying potential for congestive heart failure, the significant metabolic disruptions, the liver risks when stacked and layered on top of that, the complete absence of established long-term safety data, the sources collectively strongly advise against the use of MK-677, especially for a young person. The potential for causing serious, irreversible harm simply far outweighs any temporary, uncertain, or unproven benefits it might offer.
So for anyone listening who is genuinely looking to improve their physical performance, build muscle, get fitter safely, what are the actual evidence-based paths forward? What should they be focusing on?
Look, sustainable muscle growth, strength gains, and achieving fitness goals can be done safely and effectively. It relies on the well-established, evidence-based methods we know work. Consistent, appropriately structured resistance training tailored to your individual goals. Optimizing your nutrition to properly fuel your body's needs for performance and recovery. Prioritizing adequate, high-quality sleep, which is absolutely vital for recovery and hormone regulation. And employing smart recovery strategies.
And the key difference.
These methods are legal, they support your long-term health and well-being, and crucially, they do not introduce the profound, unpredictable, and potentially devastating risks associated with using unapproved investigational substances like MK-677. You build health, not gamble with it.
That's a powerful summary and really brings together all the data we've explored. It takes us right back to that initial point about the importance of doing your research, making informed decisions.
Exactly. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to sit with after this deep dive. When you're considering a substance like MK-677, where arguably the most critical piece of information you could possibly want, the full extent of its long-term safety, the true potential for irreversible damage down the road is simply not known. What does it truly mean to prioritize your long-term health and well-being, especially when you're young, with potentially decades of life ahead of you? What level of risk is genuinely acceptable when that risk is fundamentally, inescapably unquantifiable?
A lot to think about there. Thank you so much for guiding us through this really complex and, as you say, deeply concerning body of evidence on MK-677.
My pleasure. At the end of the day, being genuinely informed with the real data, not just the hype, is your best defense when you're navigating these kinds of complex decisions about your health and your body.